I'd like to welcome you to our April webinar, The Open Hand, Contemplative Practice in a Course on Arguing as an Art of Peace, with Barry Kroll, Professor of English at Lehigh University. Barry Kroll received his PhD from the University of Michigan and taught in the English departments at Iowa State University and Indiana University before becoming the first Robert Rodal Professor of Writing at Lehigh University, a position he has held for the past 20 years. At Lehigh, he has served as Writing Program Administrator and Department Chair, along with teaching a variety of courses in composition and literature. His recent work develops his interest in an expanded approach to argumentation by drawing on contemplative pedagogy as well as training in Aikido. I'd now like to welcome Barry, who will be talking to us today about a course he has been teaching to first-year students, using a pedagogy that he discusses in his recent book, The Open Hand, Arguing as an Art of Peace. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, as Jen said, my name is Barry Kroll, and I'm going to be talking about a course I've been teaching to first-year students at Lehigh University, which is a private residential university in eastern Pennsylvania with about 5,000 undergraduates. I've got some students in the room with me who will be participating in the presentation a little bit later. All of them are former students in my course, an English course called Arguing as an Art of Peace. I'm going to let them just say their names and say hi to you, and you'll hear a lot more from them later.
Hi, I'm Taylor.
Hi, I'm Tamara.
Hi, I'm Ryan.
And hi, I'm Kendall.
So I'm going to assume that you're listening to this webinar because, like me, you're intrigued by contemplative pedagogy and interested in hearing how other college teachers have tried to infuse practices of mindfulness into their academic courses. I know when I've attended seminars and conferences on contemplative mind in higher ed, I've often learned the most by listening to other teachers explain how they use contemplative practices in their classrooms, even if they're talking about art history or economics or even physics. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to talk about what I've been doing in a course I've been teaching regularly for about the last 7 years. I'm far from an expert, but I'd like to share some of my efforts to induce contemplative practices in an English course called Arguing as an Art of Peace. The course I teach is an inquiry-based, writing-intensive topical seminar for first-year students in the College of Arts and Sciences. Students choose a course from a list of options on a wide range of topics to fulfill their first-year seminar requirement. So the topic for my seminar is arguing. And the overarching question I pose for our inquiry is this: how can arguing, so often associated with controversy and conflict, be practiced as an art of peace? I use the figures of the open hand and the closed fist to represent different orientations to argument. And my students are pretty familiar with the closed fist from previous experience. It's the approach rooted in assertiveness and adversarialism. It's a kind of argument that's so common in our life that Deborah Tannen even describes our society as an argument culture. In her book, she says, the book is about a pervasive warlike atmosphere that makes us approach public dialogue and just about anything else we need to accomplish as if it were a fight. There's a tendency that has served us well in many ways, but in recent years has become so exaggerated that it is getting in the way of solving our problems. Our spirits are corroded by living in an atmosphere of unrelenting contention and argument culture. As one of my students said in response to this, it seems to me the argument culture obviously exists in our culture, yet it is so ingrained in us that we don't even realize how much and how often we argue. Well, I wanted students to consider alternatives to unrelenting contention. So I asked the question, what other ways can we argue? Whether we're having a tense conversation about financial responsibility with a parent or writing a paper about a controversial public issue. How can we argue with an open hand rather than using a closed fist? Because the seminar was inquiry-driven, I asked students to keep a notebook of their observations and reflections, and I'm going to be showing quite a few of those excerpts throughout my talk. And to give you a little bit of a sense of the voices behind these excerpts, I've asked some of my former students here with me in the room, to read the excerpts when I project them. Now, although my class met 3 times a week in a pretty conventional classroom setting, we had discussions, went over assignments, held workshops, once a week we met in another session that I call the Experiential Learning Lab. There, students continued to explore arguing, but by using other modes of inquiry, body movement exercises, as well as meditation and a variety of mindfulness practices. So the students in my seminar were exploring how to argue differently with an open hand, not only by engaging in argument analysis, rhetorical practice, but also by participating in the Experiential Learning Lab, where they were learning to move their bodies and focus their minds. The first-year seminars are gateway courses at most institutions, and the emphasis is usually on intellectual or academic transitions. Now, I'll admit that I was focused on that intellectual aspect of the transition, at least initially. So I introduced contemplative practice as a way to develop certain dispositions and habits of mind that would support arguing as an art of peace, which was our primary topic of inquiry. But a gateway course should also support first-year students as they are settling into life at a residential university. The longer I taught the course, the more clearly I saw that from the student's perspective, the contemplative practices were appealing because they provided ways to cope with the stresses and strains of college. The bridge they needed was emotional and affective, not just academic. So I learned to encourage students when they applied the practices to aspects of their everyday lives, even though I kept the focus on our main topic of inquiry, arguing. Because the focus of my course was arguing, we began by exploring our normal approaches to conflict. Everyone knows that when we're arguing with adversaries, we're involved in disagreement, confrontation, and conflict. The question is how to respond to this situation. As I've said, one common approach is to close the fist, preparing for a fight. Students often wrote about this propensity in their notebooks.
In my junior year of high school, my history class occasionally held debates. One girl on the other team stated her points, and I calmly refuted them. After a while, the entire debate was just the two of us heatedly arguing back and forth. The teacher called an end to it when the girl threatened to kill me. Her anger over this battle of words surprised me. True, I had crushed her points, but that didn't mean she needed to react that strongly.
In high school, I was opinionated and held little respect toward opposing viewpoints. My essays gave the illusion of understanding of the opposing side's view, when in reality I was trying to destroy it. I used to love debating controversial issues. It was actually fun to deliver the final point in a debate that would cripple the opposing view's entire argument.
My usual approach to argument is aggressive, fierce, and some may say relentless. I really don't like to use arguments, and even more than that, I thoroughly enjoy winning.
Whenever I argue, I tend to uncage some sort of inner monster in order to coerce my opponent into giving up.
So the students were pretty familiar with the closed fist approach. I wanted to explore the alternative of the open hand. So the heart of my course involved teaching students to open their hands when they encountered an adversarial argument, rather than instinctively and reflexively closing their fists. I wanted them to be able to use open hand tactics even when they were writing essays about controversial public issues. So throughout the course, we focused on some strategies for arguing with an open hand, including reframing, turning debate into discussion, finding common ground, which involved identifying shared interests or options for mutual gain, and listening attentively, that is, listening first, wholeheartedly, before presenting your point of view. We spent a lot of time working with these strategies before students wrote their papers. Even so, the assignments were challenging because they asked students to do something they hadn't done before.
It was difficult to switch gears from writing a one-sided, aggressive paper.
I have become so accustomed to writing argumentative papers with the objective of forcing people to opposite ends of the spectrum. I could not seem to get my mind away from the type of controversial writing I was used to.
With as much training and discussion as we have had, I still had a difficult time not reverting to a combative tone. After reading through my first draft for the paper, I thought, that sounds terrible. Even I feel attacked as the reader.
So one way I tried to support students was to teach them a series of body movement exercises with a partner. It's one thing to learn about strategies conceptually, but another to have a bodily felt sense for a conciliatory response. Our first lab session began with two students pushing against one another. If your partner pushes against you, the normal response is to resist and push back. This is a paradigm of traditional argument, refute and assert. But there's another paradigm in which aggressive energy is handled differently. I showed students how to blend, redirect, lead, and turn around an aggressive force. I got them involved kinesthetically, moving their bodies in patterns derived from two-person Tai Chi and Aikido. And I'm going to say more about that aspect of the course later on. For now, I want to focus on the other aspect of my course that made it unusual pedagogically, the contemplative component. Once again, I introduced this strand as an inquiry project inviting students to explore the practices. I usually began with sitting meditation, starting with minimal instructions and a few minutes of sitting, followed by a discussion of what students experienced during the session. Now here's an example of a comment that a student wrote after one of the first sessions.
On the first day of class, when I learned that we would be meditating every Friday, I was slightly worried. I wasn't sure how it would go, and I really didn't want to be that guy who fidgets around and ruins meditation for everyone else in the room. Despite my fears, I was actually very pleased with how our first meditation went. I was surprised how I was able to sit completely still for multiple minutes at a time without moving, something that I've probably never done before. To not have any thoughts is a wonderful feeling.
Let me just pause for an aside here to note that many of these slides that I'm going to be showing have photographs of the first-year students who took my course and gave me permission to use these photos in presentations, alongside excerpts from students' notebooks. But the photos and statements are not correlated. That is, the statements weren't made by the students in the photos. So the photos really are for purposes of illustration only. I paid a lot of attention to what students were saying in their notebooks and watched for questions that needed to be addressed in class. I also assigned some short essays about meditation and mindfulness. So one of the questions that came up often was whether meditation was a religious practice, so whether it entailed a Buddhist religious affiliation and whether it was consistent with other commitments. So I tried to talk about this by using some short passages from authors that I think address this well. For example, Andrea Miller says most spiritual traditions, including Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam, have profound contemplative practices. The Buddhist approach to mindfulness, however, is often seen as a valuable tool for people of all faiths or no faith because it doesn't require a belief system. Andrew Weiss says, you do not have to be a Buddhist to practice mindfulness in a non-sectarian context. You can be a Christian, a Jew, a Hindu, or an agnostic and still practice the Buddhist teaching on mindfulness without any conflict. I find that I can practice them without having to abandon my ancestral spiritual roots, which were Jewish, without giving up one iota of who I am. But mainly, we practice sitting once a week for increasingly longer sessions with the goal of 15 to 20 minutes by the end of the semester.
Last week, when we first did meditation, I had difficulty getting myself to relax, clear my mind, and actually meditate. When we meditated again this Friday in class, I found it much easier. Again, the first few moments were hard as I found myself trying too hard to clear my mind, only causing me to think more about the day ahead. But I was shortly able to zone out the fact that I was in a circle with a dozen other kids and focus on only my breathing. I lost complete track of time, and when you finally announced time was up, I struggled opening my eyes right away.
During short periods of in-class meditation, I have found quieting my mind more difficult than I have admitted. When the bell first rings, there is an agonizingly long moment in which my mind says, okay, all thoughts away into their filing cabinets. And then, of course, I'm still unwittingly holding on to most of them. A few rise to the surface, and I try to steer clear of them. It isn't easy. Once I've mostly let go, the main thought is, what now?
Sitting became important to many students with effects that sometimes linger beyond our class sessions.
After class, I spent the remainder of the afternoon relishing in what I would call the most important thing I've learned thus far in the course. We had just finished our 12-minute meditation, and I was feeling more awake than usual. I felt on a level beyond the all-too-common, mind-racing, jittery state of awareness that follows my routine caffeine jolts. I felt different that afternoon, clear-headed, fully conscious, and purely awake. This experience has undoubtedly been one of the most important things I have learned thus far.
Although sitting together was a consistent practice, I was also interested in encouraging students to explore practices they could take off the cushions and into their everyday lives. I urged them to look for opportunities to be mindful, fully present, wide awake, purposefully aware, as they went about their everyday lives as busy college students. My rationale was that by developing habits of mindfulness, they would be prepared to enter arguments with a different frame of mind, with awareness, equanimity, and focused attention. Some students were drawn to the practice of mindful walking.
On Friday, I left early for my philosophy class so that I could take my time walking there and not have to be so rushed. With my phone in my bag and no pressure to speed walk, it was an entirely different world. I looked around at the people who passed me. They all looked like they were in a rush, like I usually am. I focused on my walking and realized how weird it was that it's just a process that we do so often without thinking. Mindfully putting one foot in front of the other felt better than usual. It was nice to slow down for a change and appreciate my surroundings. It helped to take some of the stress away that I was feeling.
As I walked back to my dorm last week, I felt as though I had walked that route for the first time, mindfully. I reached the middle of one of the staircases I had to climb when I suddenly asked myself how I got there. At that point, I turned around to look at all the steps I had climbed and could not believe that I had zoned out while I was walking. I continued to climb the stairs, trying to feel each step and appreciate each time my legs fluidly lifted my body up to the next step. When I climbed the stairs that night, I tried to actually feel myself moving from one step to the next. I was being mindful of my body, my thoughts, and my surroundings. As I turned back around and took a long, deep breath, I shook my head, smiled, and thought to myself, wow, what a moment.
Students were often quite inventive about finding opportunities to practice mindfulness.
This morning, I mindfully painted my nails. I let myself take in each and every action. I opened the polish, feeling how the cap slowly became unstuck from the dried polish inside, and smelling its strong scent, I then focused on the dripping of the polish off the brush and back into the bottle. I began to paint my left hand. Because I was so concentrated on painting my nails, focusing on only what I was doing, there was an absence of scattered thoughts in my mind.
This morning, as I was brushing my teeth, getting ready to go out for breakfast, I realized that my actions were very mechanical. I had not thought once about the entire process. As I was putting my toothbrush back in the cubby, I realized that I had no idea how I felt while I was running the toothbrush over my teeth. When I went back to brush my teeth after breakfast, I decided to look at this everyday process from a different angle. I decided to pay attention to it, to take note of how I felt, what the toothpaste tasted like, what mood I was in. What was I thinking about as I brushed my teeth? I felt as if I had finally woken up to a process I had been performing for years.
Mindful eating was a particularly rich exercise for many students. In class, we did that classic exercise of eating one raisin, slowly and mindfully. And this encouraged a number of students to see if they could eat mindfully in other contexts.
This Saturday, I decided to experiment with mindfulness. Much like the eating a raisin activity we had in class, only on a larger scale, I decided to eat each one of my meals slowly and mindfully.
Lately, I've been trying to focus more on eating. Similar to what we did with the raisin in class, I tried to clear my mind before I ate and appreciate the experience. I took a few breaths so that I could appreciate the aroma of my pasta before I actually tasted it. I noticed the colors, textures, and smells of it, and all the other foods around me. I stabbed 2 noodles with my fork and put them in my mouth. I made an effort to notice the texture and taste of it while I chewed slowly. I repeated this process with each bite and felt a lot better about eating. Usually, I eat so fast that I barely notice how much I'm eating, and don't take the time to appreciate each bite. It is too often that I am a few bites away from finishing my food and it hits me that I don't even remember eating it at all.
Last night, I was sitting in my dorm room waiting to meet my friends, and I was hungry, so I went for some ice cream. It was frozen, unfortunately, so I had to meticulously scrape off layers from the top, which slowed me down and made me enjoy each spoonful. It tasted really good. There was a mix of strawberries, graham crackers, and cheesecake. I thought to myself, wow, I really love this ice cream flavor. Then it was as if the articles hit me in the head. I was being mindful of eating the ice cream and noticing all of the taste because I had to be, because the ice cream was frozen. I literally slowed down eating it, and because of that, I noticed more and enjoyed it more. That was the best ice cream I've tasted, and I'm pretty sure it's because I slowed down eating it.
Students needed little encouragement to experiment with mindfulness when they confronted their pressing deadlines, difficult examinations, challenging assignments, distraction, and overload. Here is another series of excerpts from their notebooks where the students talk about the applications of mindfulness to their experience of being students.
I sit here in the library staring at the clock. 3 o'clock already? I look back down at my assignment pad. I've only completed one of my assignments that's due tomorrow. The wrath and punishment of procrastination. My mind begins to wander. I stop myself to sit back. I close my eyes and I count my breaths. 1, 2, 3. The library seems to fade from me, and I'm in a different world. I focus on my breathing and I let my mind clear. I breathe as the thoughts of home and work escape my mind. I breathe in and breathe out. I slowly open my eyes and I'm sitting back in the library. My work is still on the table. I go back to work more relaxed and with a lot less on my mind, and a new appreciation for mindful meditation.
I sat down on the floor of my room and timed myself for 5 minutes. I decided to meditate just because I needed to relax for a few minutes and not think about the workload I had. For the first 30 seconds, I thought that this was ridiculous. But then I began to listen. I heard people driving around outside the dorm, girls in my hall laughing, and the sound of my blinds hitting the window. The entire world went on revolving around me while I just sat there. I was focused.
I had my calculus exam at 4 o'clock on Thursday, and as I sat in my seat waiting for the test to be handed out, my nerves were raging out of control. My hands were trembling. I looked up, saw that I had about 3 minutes to spare, and decided to close my eyes and meditate. I focused on my breathing. There was chaos about me. Students shouting, desks creaking, backpacks being zippered open and shut. But for those 3 minutes, the noise faded into the background, and all I could hear was my breath. Although it was slightly embarrassing to have my professor tap me on my shoulder because he thought I was sleeping, I started the exam with a fresh, calm mind.
I immediately recalled the articles relating to meditation, saying to acknowledge concerns and then let them go. I knew no better way to calm my nerves than to simply meditate. I gave myself 3 minutes, for I did not have much time to spare, to sit down on my bed with my legs crossed and eyes shut. I concentrated on my breathing, gently thinking in and out. I felt my body loosening all the knots in my shoulders, and I sensed the tension slowly dissipating. When the 3 minutes were over, I walked to my desk and started organizing the tasks. It became less confusing the more I wrote. I worked on my homework for the rest of the night and ended up sleeping better than I had in days.
I couldn't stop my mind from wandering. I thought to myself, maybe this will help. I sat on my newly cleaned floor, set the time to 5 minutes, and closed my eyes. I focused on my breathing, appreciated the moments of bliss, and then heard the beeping of the timer. I opened my eyes, sat back down at my desk, and thought about my topic. It was much easier to focus now that I had a clear mind. I continued with my essay, only to discover that my writer's block was gone. Ideas were flowing out of my mind continuously. I was no longer distracted by the chatter of my own thoughts. It's really cool to me how useful meditation and being purposefully wears both inside and outside of the classroom. I like how what we do isn't just germane to the class only, but it's more of strategies and tactics that can be applied to everyday life.
During the lab session, we did a few special activities designed to broaden students' experience of mindfulness. One of the ones that was always very popular was to paint an enso, which I presented as an exercise in concentration.
It was interesting to explore a new type of meditation unlike what we have tried before, such as our weekly sitting meditation. It was surprising how much concentration was actually needed for the paintings to be successful and how much the paintings depicted this. This was one of my favorite labs because even though I enjoy sitting meditation, I also like when we explore other forms.
One of the most interesting journal entries I received was by a student who recorded a kind of internal monologue about doing the exercise. It's really interesting to see the flow of her mind through the process.
I'm going to hold a paintbrush, breathe out, and create a circle. Okay, I can handle that. Now, make that circle without trying to make it. Let it be. Whatever you say. I breathe in, trying not to think about how ridiculous this would look to a bystander, or how everyone is watching as I think I am going to show my artistic talent, or rather, my lack thereof. What do I have to lose? Pride? Who cares? Here it goes. As my brush hits the paper, I try to forget everything and just breathe out. I end up with an open-ended circle, starting bold in the beginning and trailing to a firecracker tail with less paint. It could very well be first-timer's luck, but I really liked my circle. I liked how there was no definitive ending, because I don't have an affinity for definitive endings. I don't know where I want to end up in my life, and I don't need my endings to have complete closure. My painting is hanging in my room at home to remind me of one trivial moment in which I was truly present and created my own outcome.
Another technique I introduced during class was rapid centering, the practice of taking several calming breaths, sometimes repeating a key word when breathing in and then out. Many students were drawn to this practice.
I really liked some of the quick centering exercises. I have been using the one where I think one word as I breathe in and think a different word as I breathe out.
I like the idea of just pausing for a mindful 3 breaths to clear my mind. I have begun to practice this meditation whenever I think of it, but hope it will become a part of my daily routine. I want to reach the point where I can initiate the 3-breath method and refresh my mind whenever I feel necessary. The words I chose to say are calm on the inhale and relaxed on the exhale. Both of the words together give me a firm sense of inner peace.
I think the mindfulness on the go focus was great because sometimes we don't have the time to sit for 15 minutes.
The approach of taking 3 breaths is very appealing to me. Since the task involves saying 2 different words on the inhale and exhale, you do not need to be consciously trying to clear your mind. The focus becomes on the words while also closing your mind off to all other thoughts.
Well, I've been focusing on the contemplative component of the course, but it was embedded in a class that was mainly about how arguing could be practiced as an art of peace, using an open hand rather than a closed fist. I encourage students to see contemplative practices as relevant for arguing, especially arguments that entail disagreement and intense conflict. Disagreement, especially face-to-face confrontation, is emotionally intense. And I hope that contemplative practice would help students face conflict with equanimity rather than anger or fear. Stress leads to distraction, and I wanted students to learn how to concentrate and pay close attention when they were engaged in arguments and difficult conversations. And I hoped that students would learn to listen attentively and compassionately to views that conflicted with their own. Much of our work in the course involved learning how to use less adversarial, more conciliatory tactics of arguing. In the lab, we practiced movement exercises so that students would get a kinesthetic or bodily felt sense of what it means to use an open hand. I talked about 2 aspects of the open hand. The open hand of connection, blending or receptivity, and the open hand of control, which involves leading and an element of assertiveness. These elements of connection and control are really not opposites as much as they are complementary sources of energy in an argument, a conception we explore by considering a yin-yang model. From the early lab sessions, we began with a stance that suggested confrontation. From there, students practiced a movement that provided a feel for what it's like to blend with an opposing force, rather than resisting or opposing it. In this modified push hands exercise, students began to experience the way an open hand could be receptive. As one of the students commented,
This week in class, we practiced a physical way of dealing with attacks, known as blending. As we practiced the physical movements of blending, we tried to develop a feel for how this physical experience could translate into a verbal response.
in our lab work, we practiced another set of movements derived from Aikido that provided a kinesthetic analogy for the various steps in a conciliatory argument, or what's sometimes called a Rogerian argument in the field of composition studies. In addition to blending and connecting, this kind of argument entails control. Here's what it looked like. As in Aikido, the response is to turn around the opposing force rather than confronting it head-on. Coming to a point where the two opponents stand side by side, facing in the same direction. At this point, the movements represent attentive listening. One way to respond to an aggressive argument is simply to listen to it with full attention. Our discussion of attentive listening prompted many comments in the students' notebooks as they reflected on their own habits of listening and observed those of others.
When I thought I was listening to the other side, I actually wasn't. I was not being mindful to what the opposition side was saying because I simply did not care. I'd always gotten into the habit of thinking, what is the point of really listening when I know what I believe in? This is where mindfulness comes into play for me. I have come to realize that arguing should not always be about myself, about winning, about feeling smug after I unleash a hurtful comment. Purpose should lie in finding a resolution to a problem or find enough common ground for there to be some sort of progress.
I really noticed myself not listening in conversations. When I was talking to someone in more than just small talk, the only thing going through my head was what I plan on saying next in response. If I were the other person talking to me, I wouldn't want to talk to me. It's important to me that I am heard in conversations, but then I learned that I don't listen to the other person.
I began to notice how easy it was to completely listen but not absorb what was being said, and to listen but not focus because of the thoughts running through my head of how to respond. True listening is so much more than simply being quiet.
Nobody listens, and no one listens now more than ever. I couldn't remember the last time that I actually listened to my friends talk about their days without thinking about my day.
Earlier today, I was lying in bed doing reading for my English class when I was interrupted by the girl who lives in the room across from me. She seemed to be in an argument. I soon realized that she was on the phone with her mother. She wasn't yelling at first, but I could tell there was tension between the two. The tension escalated into a full screaming fight, and I couldn't help but take an interest and eavesdrop because of my new appreciation for arguments that had come from this class. Screaming went on for what seemed like hours. The girl at one point said, "No, Mom, I don't care what you have to say about it." She was not giving her opponent any time to explain her side of the story. No wonder this argument led to a screaming fight. I couldn't help but think that all of this could have been avoided if she had used some of the tactics we discussed in class.
So I paused at this step in the movement sequence. That's the really crucial step of listening attentively. From that point, the movement gets more complicated, and I'm not going to belabor it. I discuss it more fully in my book. Essentially, the receiver leads the opponent in a 180-degree turn so they face the other direction, where both consider the receiver's view. They then move back to face differences again. No one has been persuaded. Positions have not changed, yet there is a difference. Having stood beside one another, the participants have a deeper understanding of the opposing views and why people hold them. Although they still disagree about some key issues, they have reversed positions and stood in one another's shoes. At the end of the unit, students were asked to write a paper for which they used conciliatory rather than conventional tactics for arguing. We talked a lot about this kind of arguing, seen quite a few examples of both student and professional writing. The students often found the assignment challenging nonetheless.
The conciliatory style of writing has given me a lot more trouble than I expected it would. We talked so much about it in class, and I feel I have a good idea about the concepts and techniques, but it is just so different from regular writing. I feel like I've been programmed for years to write in a certain way, and it has become second nature. I really have to focus to write in this style.
Actually, writing the conciliatory paper did not go as I thought it would. For one thing, I struggled with presenting the opposition's side. Prior to writing, I thought I could smoothly and effectively introduce the arguments of the other side. However, I got to the third paragraph and realized that what I was saying sounded satirical and insincere, without even meaning to. I sounded as if I were mocking the points of the opponents. I tried my best to understand the other side, and I think I did, but I suppose my deep support for my viewpoint got the best of me. Once again, I have realized how hard it is to refrain from writing a traditional English paper.
So old habits die hard. But what I found gratifying were statements that revealed how useful the kinesthetic exercises were to some students when they began to write this paper.
The connection between the conciliatory paper and the Aikido move that corresponds to it was really clear to me and really helped me visualize the progression of my second paper.
I felt that Aikido analogies really helped me grasp the concepts of the course, especially for the conciliatory paper. The movements helped me guide my way through my writing.
As I was trying to write the introduction for this conciliatory paper, I turned to what we've done using the Aikido tactics. I never thought that just reflecting on these techniques would really help me get a move on my paper. The physical aspect of the turning and facing different directions really helped illustrate the purposes and effectiveness of the strategy. Usually, I'd focus on persuading my opposition. However, from the Aikido tactics, I physically saw how the opposing parties can reach a mutual understanding that makes the solution process a lot easier.
Now, these tactics of the open hand that students were learning sometimes seemed in opposition with what they were learning in other classes, where they were being taught more conventional tactics of arguing. One student talked about this conflict rather clearly.
I'm also taking English, and as I'm sure you know, typical English classes are completely the opposite of ours. Make a strong claim and support it. Don't flip-flop sides. Prove a point. So I always find it somewhat ironic that in one class I'm learning how to support my ideas and convince the reader of my one-sided argument, and I'm doing the complete opposite in another. But I actually feel as if I'm benefiting from performing on both ends of the spectrum. I believe that reframing arguments in our class will allow me to also develop stronger arguments in my English class. I guess it is like the yin and the yang. I need both experiences to gain a more holistic view on things and hone my skills.
But the unorthodox nature of arguing as an art of peace really seemed to resonate with some of the students.
Unorthodox argument tactics in martial arts are skills unlike anything I have ever learned or known. It can be expected that it's not going to be a smooth transition. As I sit here, though, and think about what sticks out in my mind so far, it has really begun to hit me that this is what true learning is all about. My learning has taken place in my bed at night as I attempt to meditate, in the library as I've scratched line after line out of my paper because I've accidentally reverted to traditional arguments, on the meditation cushions as I struggle to clear my mind, and out on the patio of Drown Hall as I have practiced Tai Chi with a partner.
How did mindfulness impact arguing? One pattern I saw in students' comments was their use of mindful breathing when they encountered a conflict.
I took a few deep belly breaths and viewed the argument from a more detached, mindful perspective.
Here are some other entries in which students mentioned the connection between breathing and equanimity in argumentative conflicts. The first is about a phone conversation with the student's father.
I felt that familiar feeling of extreme annoyance, and all I wanted to do was hang up the phone and avoid the situation. But this time, I tried a different approach. I took a deep breath. I took a big, deep breath, and it really calmed me down. It dissolved the immediate rush of feelings I got in the beginning of the argument and allowed me to see the argument clearer. This breathing was a sort of meditation. It settled my emotions and calmed my mind.
So here's another account from a different entry of a difficult conversation.
In the past, my reaction to this statement would have been completely defensive. I might have started getting angry, and I might have said mean things. I might have even burst out crying. This time, I stopped and took a very slow, calming breath. I knew that arguing with him, as we always have, would get me nowhere.
And this next excerpt also focuses on how breathing practices can support equanimity during arguments.
Being engaged in the present moment has helped me start to see how to approach arguing from a different perspective. The same breathing practices that make me more mindful of my everyday activities can help me become more mindful during conflicts. Being more mindful during conflicts will help me be more open and understanding of opposing viewpoints.
We've already been talking about what you might call real-world arguments, and there were some longer entries in the students' notebooks where they explored mindful arguing in realistic situations. I want to show you a couple of them. One student applied the principles of attentive listening to a difficult conversation with her boyfriend.
My boyfriend happens to be a very hard-headed person, and at times having a conversation with him is quite difficult. For months now we have been trying to figure out whether or not to break up, and I finally decided to give these methods a try. I told him that I had a lot on my mind and that it was important for him to hear me out, but that first I had never really delved into his feelings on the matter before, and I guess since I was finally willing to hear him out completely, he was willing to take that step. After hearing his side, I then went on to do the step that I thought was the silliest, the repeating of their side. I never really understood this part until now. Once I repeated to him what I thought he was trying to say, he corrected me and said, "Yeah, that's part of it, but it's more about," and it turns out that I really didn't understand his side like I thought I did. This was a really useful step because once he had finished and I had understood what he had said, he said, "You really heard me out this time. I want to hear what you have to say now." And the conversation took a turn in a direction that I'd never had before.
Another student used an open hand when she encountered resistance during a conversation with her mother.
Last week, I called my mom and explained that I would need to invest in some shoes more suitable for lower temperatures. Normally, when my mom responds with an unsatisfactory "maybe" or "I'll get back to you," for matters like this, I tend to fight back aggressively. This time, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about ways to effectively incorporate what I've learned thus far to achieve my goal. I decided to employ a balance of receptivity and assertiveness and work with my mother's energy, not completely demolishing her claims with my words, but not fleeing from them either. The most surprising thing is that this method actually worked. It was surprising because it was the first time I deliberately put what I've learned into action, and to see it happen was something else. My mom, shocked by the sudden change in my handling of conflicts and my less aggressive tone, jokingly said that she finally understood the merits of college.
In one of the most memorable series of entries, a student talked about a difficult relationship that had developed with her father, in which they had really stopped talking altogether because it always led to conflict and exacerbated tension. Here's an excerpt from the very first entry she made in her notebook.
My main reason for taking arguing as an art of peace is quite straightforward. I need to learn how to better communicate with my father. Our relationship began deteriorating when I was in high school. I was developing new perspectives, many of which did not align with his. We were both stubborn and opinionated. As time went on, I gave up trying to talk to him, and we grew further apart. I simply stopped talking because I felt that he would unconditionally oppose me. I was tired of arguing. This is the phase in which our relationship is now. Whenever he says something I strongly disagree with or find offensive, I simply hold my tongue. This has prevented us from arguing in the traditional sense, but it has often led me to seethe for hours. Clearly, I need to learn how to fix our inability to communicate. Can a different type of argument help me heal my relationship with my father?
About midway through the course, this student made another entry in which she described a particularly difficult conversation with her father over how to pay for college, a conversation that took place when the student went home for the weekend. Although quite upset by what her father was saying about having to move back home, she tried to respond with an open hand. The results surprised her.
In the past, my reaction to this statement would have been completely defensive. I might have started getting angry, and I might have said mean things. I might have even burst out crying. This time, I stopped and took a very slow, calming breath. I knew that arguing with him, as we always have, would get me nowhere. I guess my learning to be mindful and reading all about the different ways to argue made it easier for me to converse with my father. Doing all this was really difficult at times, and there were many moments when I thought I could not handle being calm and diplomatic for one more second. I guess breaking out of the argumentative mindset takes a lot more effort than I thought, but it is definitely worth it. It helped me take the first step to changing my relationship with my father.
Near the end of the semester, the same student described another tense conversation with her father, because in this case, she needed to disagree with a decision he'd made, kind of conversation that never had gone well. In this case, however, the conversation went differently, and at the end of the course, she had this to say.
Several months ago, this conversation would have taken all the wrong turns. I would have gotten emotional, and my father would have gotten angry, and that I was complaining about something after all he has done for me. However, I am now able to use different techniques to get what I want without resorting to counterproductive argument. Taking this course really did help me achieve the goal of being able to talk to my father. It still takes conscious effort, but I can now sustain a reasonable conversation with my father without having to give up my values or having to disrespect his.
As the semester came to an end, many students wrote about the importance of the contemplative activities.
Being that this is my last entry, I thought I'd talk about what I've concluded is the most important thing I'm going to take with me as the class comes to an end. I thoroughly feel that the focus on mindfulness and being in the present has allowed me to grasp a new appreciation for life. By cultivating the habit of consciously appreciating these moments, I am confident that I will continue to feel more fulfilled, content, and aware.
I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I find the mindfulness aspects of this class more interesting than the argument aspects. I feel like they add to one another, though. In order to argue more peacefully, you need to be mindful. Mindful of the other person's view, feelings, biases, etc. If you can't do that, the argument probably won't be nearly as successful.
In all honesty, I probably gained the most from the contemplative strand of the course. I think that what struck me most was the realization that contemplation has relevance in almost every aspect of daily life. I think that this idea will stick with me for a long time.
One of the most important things I've improved about myself over this semester is being mindful. I think about it every day as I walk to class.
Even if the enthusiasm for mindfulness overshadowed in their minds what they had learned about arguing, I was convinced that the two were connected in ways that weren't always easy to put into words. One student put this very well.
Although it is difficult to explain the connection between mindfulness and argument in this course, I've attempted to explain it to my mom and some of my friends, probably in vain. Anyone in our class can most likely recognize the connection, even if it is in a deep, more abstract way that cannot be translated into words.
Well, I presented only a slice of the pedagogy involved in my course on arguing as an art of peace. In my book, The Open Hand, I devote much more attention, especially to the structures and strategies that allowed students to argue differently, as well as more details about the movement exercises. For this presentation, I've emphasized the mindfulness component of my first-year seminar, foregrounding my students' responses and discoveries. I hope their words have been instructive and inspiring. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Barry, for sharing your work with us, and thank you also to the students for sharing your experiences and reflections today. We have just a few minutes for some questions, so at this point we'd like to invite everyone to type in your questions for the presenters, and then we'll have just a couple minutes, about a minute of silence on this end to allow you to reflect and write in any questions or discussion topics. So we have a participant who's wondering if there were students who struggled with some of the practices, and if students needed to withdraw from the class, and how you handle any kind of difficulties that come up.
I never had difficulties that serious that someone needed to withdraw from the class. One of the advantages I had was that because this was a first-year seminar, students knew some things about the topic of the course before they enrolled in it. So they saw a description where I mentioned that we would be doing some contemplative practices and we would be doing some movement exercises in the lab. So they sort of knew that that was going to take place, and I think that helped a bit. Another thing I did was I didn't grade any of the activities in the lab. It was, in a sense, I suppose, optional, but everybody came. I was very loose about participation. You know, if students didn't want to sit on a cushion, I said they could sit in their chairs. They just wanted to close their eyes for a minute, they could. Didn't take attendance in the lab. So it was really, I think there were enough safety valves there for the students who felt less connected to the mindfulness component of the class to not feel coerced into participating. But the honest truth is that, I mean, in 7 years, I can think of maybe 2 students who were skeptical or had qualms about it, and I just said, do what you want to do, and it's fine because it didn't affect their grade.
Thank you. I know that that's an issue that arises sometimes, so it's great to hear some insight about that. Looks like there's another question for the students if they're still with you. And this participant wanted to know, how do you plan to continue incorporating contemplative practices into your life if you choose to do so?
I'll just say that a lot of these entries, the journal entries, I think of myself as thinking about them even a year after I've taken the course. So I walk around campus and think sometimes, oh, how did I get here? Or I'm chewing a bite, oh, like, where did my food go? And I'm just thinking back, you know, take each moment at a time and, you know, thinking back to the very basics and trying to apply them. When the semester gets rough, you know, when you have a lot going on, you know, take it step by step and slow things down. And when I'm listening to people, and I'm actually just yesterday I was listening to someone and I realized that I wasn't actually listening to them, and I kind of was like, shoot, pay attention. So I think just having taken the course, your entire life will be changed as long as you really internalize everything that Professor Kroll has taught.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more quick question. One participant has asked, do your colleagues at the university incorporate some of these contemplative methods after witnessing your work, and what is the greater impact on the campus?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? I think there are a couple of places where it's flourished. I have a colleague who was not in my department, but who operates a kind of writing support service across campus, and he very explicitly works meditation and mindfulness into his courses. I've participated in his training sessions for tutors. That's, I think, one of the most robust areas where I'm seeing, you know, some kind of influence, I guess. You know, we're a very small community here of people, I think, who are doing contemplative education. You know, I think it can be kind of lonely work, but I have some really great students and very good colleagues, and I guess I'm happy with the results that I'm seeing.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you again so much, Barry, and all the students who've joined you today. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And now I'd just like to announce some of our upcoming events at the Center. On May 3rd, 2014, we will be holding a one-day contemplative retreat for educators at the Friends Meeting House in Washington, D.C., and registration will remain open until April 23rd. Our 10th annual summer session on contemplative pedagogy will be held August 3rd through 8th, 2014, and will take place at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. We're currently accepting applications for the summer session. The next ACMHE conference will be held October 10th through 12th, 2014 at the University of Washington in Seattle. Please check our website and your email inbox for announcements regarding registration for these events. Just to remind everyone, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the website soon if you'd like to share it with colleagues. Thank you for listening.